gentlemen, I'm very pleased to extend greetings and welcome to every participant of this online panel discussions of the International and Interdisciplinary Conference, Challenges of Source Evaluation in Science and Correlated Areas. I'm very happy to say that we are about to start the first online panel discussion, which is dedicated to classification of sources and assessing the credibility of them in conducting the scientific research. My name is Kanykei, and I'm very honored to be your moderator on this panel. Let me please introduce every speaker on this panel, in the order they are given the floor. Dr. Oleg Maltsev, author, criminologist, psychologist, photographer, and investigative journalist. He's an academician of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, founder and director of the Memory Institute, and head of Expeditionary Corps, which regularly conducts field researches around the globe and has a unique library with thousands of film photographs, manuscripts, and treatises. Dr. Maltsev is an author of numerous books in the areas such as applied history, sociology, depth psychology, philosophy, criminalistics, and criminology. He is an editor of several interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journals. We are very happy to greet you, Dr. Oleg Maltsev. Dr. Douglas Kellner, author, critical theorist, distinguished professor in the Department of Education, Gender Studies, and Germanic Languages at UCLA. Professor Kellner collaborated with Stephen Best on an award-winning trilogy of books examining postmodern terms in philosophy, the arts, and science and technology. He served as the literary executor of the documentary filmmaker Emile de Antonio and acted as editor of collected papers of Herbert Marcuse. We are very happy to greet you, Professor Kellner. Professor Liudmyla Fylypovych, religious scholar, head of the Department of Philosophy and History of Religion in the Institute of Philosophy by Skovoroda, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Professor Fylypovych is a vice president of the Ukrainian Association of Religious Studies. She is an executive director of the Center for Religious Information and Freedom of the Ukrainian Association of Religious Studies. We're very happy to greet you, Professor Fylypovych. Dr. Steve Gennaro, professor in the Humanities Department at York University, Canada. He explores the intersection of media, technology, psychology, and youth identity. He is one of the founding members of the Childhood and Youth Studies programs at York University, where he has taught in the Department of Humanities and the Department of Communication Studies for almost 2 decades, with more than a decade of experience teaching online. He is the author of Selling Youth and regularly publishes in the areas related to the philosophy of technology and critical media studies of youth identity and politics. We are happy to see you, Professor Gennaro. Professor Maxim Lepskiy, I think he has joined us just a minute ago. Doctor of Sciences in Philosophy, Chair of Sociology Department at Administration at Zaporozhye National University. Professor Maxim Lepskiy is the head of research board in social forecasting, Sociological Association of Ukraine. He is academician of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. These are our speakers of today's online panel. I would like to say a couple of words about a minor but an important aspect such as breaks. Officially, we are not going to have any breaks on this panel. However, if you'll need to grab a glass of water, if you need to use the restroom, please feel free to do so. Just make sure that your microphone is off. So the first question of today's panel is classification of sources presented by Professor David Procoppio, discussion of the given model and classification. And the floor is given to Dr. Oleg Maltsev.
Добрый день, уважаемые дамы и господа. I'm pleased to greet you, dear ladies and gentlemen.
Для меня большая честь открывать эту панель.
It's a great honor for me to be the first speaker of this panel.
При такой, я бы сказал, очень титулованной, я бы сказал так, при такой титулованной коллегии, которая меня будет слушать.
Dr. Maltsev says that actually for him it's the great honor to be the first speaker among such high-level experts and such grandly entitled speakers who are going to be here with us today.
Потому что вопрос, который мы будем обсуждать, он очень непростой.
To begin with, the first question of the discussion is a pretty complex one and rather complicated.
И так как я был непосредственным свидетелем рождения этой классификации,
And as Dr. Maltsev emphasizes, he witnessed that very moment this classification was revealed.
и позвольте я расскажу немного предыстории.
And Dr. Maltsev would also like to speak about short prehistory, like
Я
several words.
достаточно длительный промежуток времени работаю на юге Италии.
For quite a long period of time, Dr. Maltsev is doing research in the southern part of Italy.
И, в общем-то, исследования юга Италии, они очень непростые сами по себе исследования.
The southern Italian region studies, to be honest, are rather complicated ones.
И вот я, в общем-то, в один прекрасный момент познакомился с профессором Палермского университета.
And then happened a very interesting meeting. Dr. Maltsev was glad to meet one professor who is a professor in Palermitano University.
Вот, и выяснилось, что он уже достаточно длительный промежуток времени занимается этой проблематикой.
And actually, according to that meeting, we happened to realize that professor in Palermo University was researching this very field, I mean this studies, criticism field, for quite a long period of time.
То есть у него тоже на протяжении многих лет возникали эти проблемы.
I mean that professor actually faced the same problems for decades.
Вот, и он, в общем-то, долгое время изучал эту проблему источников.
And that professor was studying the source criticism aspect for a long period of time.
И, в общем-то, мы достаточно долго дискутировали саму модель.
And the discussion, we should say, was quite a long-term one.
В общем-то, и в конце концов пришли как бы к определенному общему знаменателю.
And by the end of the discussion with Professor Procoppio, two professors, two scholars actually concluded the final version of classification.
Да, и, в общем-то, на этом все, в общем-то, и остановилось. То есть мы для себя академически поняли, как классифицируются источники, и начали это использовать.
So again, the final outcome was the classification of academia sources. So the classification and the way we could apply, we can go to sources, we can cite sources and work with them. That was like the end of the conversation.
И, в общем-то, в определенный момент времени мой коллега, он сделал, в общем-то, эту классификацию достоянием научной общественности, то есть он в научно-популярном журнале опубликовал статью на эту тему.
What happened next? Actually, that professor published an article. He published the paper, actually with all these findings and classification of sources in the peer-reviewed journal.
Получил обратную связь от коллег.
There was several reviews on that very publication from his colleagues.
Да, и уже через какое-то время вышла на русском языке статья тоже в европейском журнале.
And then afterwards, this publication was translated into the Russian language and then republished.
И, в общем-то, и русскоязычная часть как бы планеты Земля смогла познакомиться с этой работой.
This is actually the short story telling us how the even Russian-speaking audience faced these results of discussion and actually was acquainted with them.
И, в общем-то, в общем-то, мы долго дискутировали саму работу.
So the discussion was pretty long. I mean, the discussion concerning the very core.
И вот я к каким выводам пришел я хочу с вами поделиться.
And Dr. Maltsev would also like to share certain conclusions he actually came to while researching this classification and source studies area.
Во-первых, эта классификация универсальна.
To begin with, this classification is pretty universal.
То
It's multifunctional.
То есть мало того, что она первая и единственная в мире.
We should be emphatic that this is the very first classification. I mean, the very first classification of sources.
Она ко всему же еще и универсальна.
Moreover, it's a multifunctional one. So you can actually use it in many scientific fields and disciplines.
И что очень важно, как отметил мой коллега из Хайдельбергского университета, что она четко определяет статус источника.
And one more colleague, he's actually a professor at Heidelberg University, he was emphatic of the fact that this very classification defines and notes the status of the source.
Мы там целой группой дискутировали эту работу.
Dr. Maltsev said that actually there was a group of scholars who were involved in this discussion.
И с моей точки зрения, эта классификация как раз показывает, как научный источник становится ненаучным.
Moreover, Mr. Maltsev is concerned, this very classification manifests the way and actually shows us the way the scientific source is turned or transferred into non-scientific one.
И эта классификация не дает вымыслу, ну, то есть придумыванию.
And this very classification doesn't allow some fake or, let me say, non-credible data to become the academician and credible data.
Потому что подобного рода случаев сейчас в академической науке огромное количество.
Because actually, to be sincere, we are witnessing too many, well, situations concerning this very fact.
Мы, конечно, впоследствии будем говорить об этом, но современные ученые не сильно себя утруждают что-либо доказывать.
Actually, we're going to speak about that afterwards as well, but the main thesis is all about contemporary scholars. Let me say, they don't need, or they feel they don't need to verify something too much.
Надо сказать, что проблема, например, письменных источников сегодня, их достоверности, является особенно актуальной по причине того, что наша академическая наука почему-то до сих пор считает, что письменные источники – это основа исследования.
There is one more problem, we should say it is a real problem. We're speaking about the relevance or significance of the written documents or the written sources. Because nowadays we're facing the fact that the majority of scholars prefer to think that written documents are like the top prior sources in academia.
Мне очень жаль, что нашего коллеги нет с нами, он заболел.
And Dr. Maltsev says that actually we're sorry that this very colleague is not together with us today because actually he is sick, he's ill.
Да, он очень парень такой крепкий, заболел.
And that that Professor Procoppio, he is a tough guy to be, well, let me say, but unfortunately right now he is ill.
Да, и заболел он не в Италии.
And he didn't catch that illness somewhere in Italy, no.
Да, где-то в Конго во время работы.
It happened somewhere in Congo, in Africa, while he was making research over there.
Да, и заболел он не коронавирусом.
And it's not corona, it's not COVID, it's something else.
Какой-то ихней африканской болезнью.
It's some sort of African influenza or African disease, something like that, but not corona.
Да, поэтому, к сожалению, с нами сейчас присутствовать не может.
That's the reason Professor Procoppio is not together with us within this very online panel.
Но с ним все в порядке, очень скоро выздоровеет.
But we definitely are concerned that pretty soon he'll recover and everything will be just fine.
Да, и я думаю, что на какой-то следующей конференции он обязательно примет с нами участие.
And we believe that the very next time on the next conference he'll be with us.
И надо сказать, что вот эта классификация, как он говорил, это результат более чем 10-летней работы его.
And Professor Procoppio actually explained that the result, I mean, the classification of the sources, classification and source ranking, that is the result of his 10 years long studies.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maltsev, for your speech. And the floor is given to Professor Kellner. Please. Please unmute yourself, Professor. We cannot hear you.
Now can you hear? Okay. Well, greetings to everyone. I'm so happy to be in this Zoom conference. I've been here in Los Angeles on lockdown since mid-March. UCLA, where I teach, is closed down. So it's wonderful to have an opportunity to talk to international scholars and colleagues. And I also give the best wishes to Professor Procoppio for a fast recovery from his illness, and look forward to meeting him sometime, either in person or through Zoom or virtual means. Now, in his piece about the rank of sources and the reliability of data in the scientific study, David Procoppio provides a classification system that, quote, makes it possible to have a clear understanding of sources used in research and to help differentiate between scientific work from a journalistic one, unquote. His paper is a comprehensive one, and I do not have internal criticisms of what I consider a useful, original, and productive paper. Oh, I should stop for translation. Should I stop for translation?
No, Professor, you should not stop. This conference is in English, and the translator of Dr. Maltsev would be translating to him personally.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think it's a very original and productive paper. I do want to suggest an external critique based on work from British Cultural Studies and Science Technology Studies, referred to as STS, that argues that science is a social construction and that concepts of science, truth, and evidence change historically over time and are often contested. I would also argue that sciences involve natural, social, and cultural science. And since my own work falls in the latter category, I will approach the notion of sources, the reliability of data and science from a social and cultural perspective as found in the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, British Cultural Studies, and French postmodern theory, such as Jean Baudrillard. I will also make a distinction between reliable and dubious journalism and information sources, and not between scientific work and journalistic work, as Professor Procoppio does. I think it's important to make that distinction, but also you can make a distinction, and that's what I think both Steve Gennaro and I will do today, between reliable journalistic, media, and internet sources, as well as academic scientific studies. Now, Procoppio's work engages a stage of history when books, peer-reviewed journals, and standard canonical academic texts and textbooks stood at the apex of ranking sources and producing reliable data for scientific studies. I suggest we're now living in a new world described in detail by Marshall McLuhan in his 1964 book, Understanding Media and Subsequent Writings, in which book culture has been supplemented by media and electronic culture in a new cultural configuration that French postmodern theorist Jean Baudrillard also described, and that Steve Gennaro, building on McLuhan, has described as the Gutenberg galaxy, contrasted to McLuhan's Gutenberg galaxy, named after the Gutenberg printing press that inaugurated the modern world, producing books, newspapers, journalism, etc., profoundly shaping, McLuhan argues, its economy, social order, politics, culture, and educational system. And I would add its concepts of reason, truth, evidence, and science. So for centuries before the rise of electronic media, broadcasting, we had literacy and culture defined by book culture. In this new cultural matrix that we now live in, information is digitized and virtualized, spread through broadcast media and social media, and even books and academic journals circulate information on the internet and social media, making it more important than ever to evaluate and rank sources, to have a clear understanding of the sources of books, articles, and studies that purport to be science, media reports information, and internet sources of a variety of sites and locations. We need to evaluate all this different form of information and knowledge, and therefore we need literacies and concepts of evidence and reliable evidence in all these fields. This is important because in the United States and countries throughout the world, especially ones with authoritarian and right-wing leaders like Donald Trump, we are engaged in cultural wars and wars against science, reason, and truth, while authoritarians and their supporters promote fake news and bogus science, as well as attacking evidence, truth, and science itself. Moreover, in the United States and throughout the world, we're immersed in a COVID-19 virus pandemic that is threatening in the US and elsewhere to get even worse as the winter season emerges. I told you in the beginning, I've been on lockdown and I can't even go into my office at UCLA because it's shut. And so obviously my paper represents this situation. From the beginning, Trump repeatedly uttered falsehoods regarding the pandemic, contributing to the more than 12,000 confirmed lies he's told as President of the United States as of August the 8th. By now, it's probably over 20,000 lies. I mean, this is unbelievable and unparalleled. A president of the United States has never systematically lied before. If a president lied, once or twice, the media would be all over him. But what's dangerous in the current situation with the pandemic is his lies about the virus, the pandemic, etc. So this has really made the notions of truth, of reason, and evidence all the more important. One theme of Trump's falsehoods promoted unapproved treatments such as hydroxychloroquine, even to the point of claiming that Trump said he was taking hydroxychloroquine to protect himself against COVID-19, despite claims by his science advisors, Tony Fauci, and other experts that it didn't work. More ridiculously, Trump advocated at one time that perhaps ingesting the cleaning detergents used to scrub and clean and sanitize surfaces might provide a cure, that we should try to drink cleaning detergents, and that'll maybe protect us from COVID. Trump's false medical advice feeds into an infodemic that describes an overload of information from public officials, from the media, from the internet, and social media. False information about the virus leads people to attempt dangerous medical solutions, often with fatal results. Facebook, Twitter, and responsible social media sites and medical authorities are forced to fight and respond to the dangerous misinformation. But in an infodemic, it is difficult to get false information under control and to advance reliable information. I might say that Facebook and other social media sites have begun to label false information. So Donald Trump, for instance, will send out a Twitter message that's a lie, and they'll identify it. They'll say, this is false misinformation, which is unbelievable that a social media company will, label the President of the United States as offering false information. Trump himself has repeatedly refused to admit mistakes as reporters confronted him with false statements or erroneous claims about the COVID-19 virus and crisis instead of blaming many others. The Washington Post estimated that around 15% of Trump's speeches were spent blaming others for the COVID pandemic, with the most frequent targets being Joe Biden and the Democrats, followed by the media, state governors, and China. So Trump basically blames everyone else, including people that had nothing to do with it, instead of taking responsibility himself. He's even gone so far as to attack science and scientific evidence in one press conference, saying that maybe science doesn't know, i.e. how to deal with the COVID virus or the facts of it, and he does, supposedly. In this context, I would argue it's a life and death matter to defend science, reason, facts, evidence, and truth, all under attack by Trump and his followers and authoritarian leaders and governments all over the world, but also to see how important the media and internet are in circulating news and information and presenting contested notions of science, fact, and medical information, making it a life and death matter to distinguish between reliable news and information and fake news, between fact-based scientific and medical evidence and quackery, and more broadly, between truth and lies. In my
Dear Professor Kellner, I hate to interrupt you, but please don't forget about the limit 8 to 10 minutes. Would you mind please wrapping up the talk in a couple of minutes? And so we will have another round, the second question.
Exactly.
Don't forget, right? We have 2 questions.
Exactly. In fact, my concluding paragraph will be, in response to the second question, I will suggest strategies for distinguishing between reliable and fake news and information and truth and lies. I will offer concepts of critical media and digital literacies developed by myself, Jeff Scher, and Steve Gennaro, who will also present on this panel in answer to the question of what constitutes reliable evidence and sources that meet rational, scientific, and epistemic criteria. So that'll be my second presentation. I'll try to answer what I consider to be reliable information.
Thank you very much, Professor Kellner. It's my bad as a moderator, I didn't tell once again to limit the answers up to 8 to 10 minutes if possible. Currently we are replying to the first question. And after that, we will have a time for second question as well. So now, Professor Fylypovych, please, the floor is given to you. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, okay. Hello. I'm glad to be together with you, and some general options before our discussion about the sources which we use for our investigation. The topic of our conference is really interesting in scholars whose research claims to be objective. Therefore, my many thanks to the initiators of the conference who are so focused on identifying the pain point of the present moment. As soon as this topic of this conference was announced, I could not stay away, because after my education, I was a historian, and for me the question of the authenticity of historical sources was always relevant. Back in 1980, my teacher formulated what a historical source is. It is a subjective image of the objective world. But I'm not a poor historian. I have already retrained as a philosopher and religious studies scholar, for whom the authenticity of the sources is very important, but not important as for the historian. And I am not a source researcher, so I could not react so deeply like Professor Douglas. But even I felt the limitations of historical sources, personal testimony, option polls, official documents prepared by very serious institutions. When I walk in the archives with the church affairs, I saw their subjectivity. But everyone has always been interested and will be interested in how much you can trust those stories, describe the facts. Among the historical sources, there are the documents that have a quaint sacred significance, including the Holy Scriptures. Believers of the religions perceive them as absolutely authentic, and the Torah, Gospel, and the Quran, and Kaziki, or another kind of sources are considered to be divinely inspired books of the extraterrestrial origin. Nevertheless, scholars are exploring them as historical sources, beckoning the supernatural way in which they were written. By additional to such clearly sacred sources, about which there has been an unproductively discussion between believers and scholars for centuries, religions produce a lot of near-religious or non-religious documents. Based on the authority of the church and religion, we traditionally trust these sources, but the longer we study them, the more questions and doubts arise. That's why we, with my colleague, Professor Alexander Sagan, decided to join to this conference, and we decided to think, is it possible to trust church sources? And if I have time, maybe later, I use some very interesting example to show how the historical sources could be manipulated by the interested person in their ideological plan to show the real life in another way. So I could stop in this moment, and I continue in some minutes, which I use to describe the very interesting initiative which appeared not 1 year ago. I mean the collection of documents which prepared by the Encyclopedia, the Orthodox Encyclopedia Church Science Center in Russia, dedicated the reunification of the Kiev Metropolitanate with the Russian Orthodox Church in 17th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fylypovych. Dr. Steve Gennaro is going to continue the discussion, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to all my fellow panelists. I'm also honored and delighted to be here with all of you. Yeah. So I'm not a scientist per se, but as a critical theorist and a philosopher of technology, my work in critical media literacy, I think, connects deeply to the points that are raised by Professor Procoppio in the article where we begin from. And even more so, I think there's validity to what he says, because authenticity in texts in academia becomes even more important than ever now that we see the removal of the referent or of truth with the decrediting of news, of media, and of scientific data from people like, for example, the President of the United States, as Dr. Kellner recently mentioned. So as we see in the popular media, the removal of truth or knowledge as accessible is something we can point to with and say that is coming from a credible space. as something we can point to and we can say, that we can fact check against. When that disappears within the mainstream of our lives, then it's even more important that it remains present in academia. So going to this then, the concerns that Procoppio raises, if we extrapolate them, if we take them out and use them as a meta framework for the exploration of knowledge, of information consumption, and technology, it provides us with, I think, an important series of questions that all interactions with media require, and not just those within academia. For example, in my work, I'm interested in how the expansion of social media has impacted our consumption of information as knowledge. So the way that we take in information, but then assume it to be knowledge. Or how the actions of certain individuals who use social networks and the current technology to bypass the mainstream media have removed, again, the credibility of the mainstream media. They've taken away the ability for just the everyday public to have something that they can trust as they come across. And of course, how have technological apparatus changed this as well? For example, the iPhone, right? I live on my iPhone, as do my children and my students and most of my colleagues. And how has an apparatus like the iPhone changed the way in which we engage with information and either accept it to be immediately knowledge without first maybe digesting what we're taking in? So maybe I should have a point of clarification here as to how I'm using these two terms, the distinction between information and knowledge. And I think in separating these terms, I'm attempting to engage with a classification system similar to what Procoppio gives us in his article about sources, where he argues that not all information is knowledge because not all sources are equal distributors. The same is true for the consumption of information by the general public with all of our interactions with media. Not all information is knowledge because not all information is actively decoded when it's consumed. So to draw a comparison to Procoppio's classification system with an analogy for eating a healthy diet, some information, if we think about it as food, can be immediately digested as knowledge. As soon as we get it, we can eat it, and it's immediately knowledge. These would be what Procoppio calls reliable sources. They are our healthy foods, okay? They are reliable sources. However, I would argue that even healthy foods themselves can arrive to us in unhealthy packaging. They can come to us in unhealthy containers. For example, an apple. I may purchase an apple, and the apple is a healthy food. But what if it's been grown in a field that relies heavily on pesticides? And what if then further chemicals are used to keep that apple fresh as it travels from farm to the supermarket? So even when we consume reliable sources or healthy foods, we must always be aware of the container, okay? The role that the container plays in delivering that information to us. And so I would add this as another step for Procoppio's article for us to think about. When we consume reliable sources or healthy foods, we must be aware of the container of that information when we consume it as knowledge. Of course, other sources, Procoppio argues, require verification. So for our food metaphor, these sources require an action on the part of the consumer or the academic or the student or the reader or the participant or the engager. So maybe this means more chewing. We have to chew our food better for digestion. We have to do something to the information as we take it in to transform it into knowledge. Okay, it could be something like a walnut that requires a cracking, a penetration of the hard surface or shell to get inside to find the protein that's located on the inside. You know, Karl Marx once argued that information, when disguised as knowledge, was an opium for the masses. And this idea is further extended by Theo Adorno and Max Horkheimer in their beautiful description of the culture industry as mass enlightenment or deception, as pablum given to the masses. So concerns regarding the expansion of mass media as disseminators of information, which they package to us as knowledge, but instead contain nothing but an emptiness of facts. Adorno and Horkheimer beautifully summarized by saying, it's like when the diner must be satisfied with the menu. because the food itself does not deliver on what it is that we have ordered. So in all cases, whether it be Marx or Adorno and Horkheimer or Procoppio, the point remains clear. Information is not always encoded with knowledge, even when it is packaged to us as healthy food for consumption. And therefore, the decoding of information for knowledge, or what Dr. Douglas Kellner on this panel has termed critical media literacy, this is a requirement for healthy digestion, all right? Healthy digestion for the self, for the individual, for learning, and for society, for a democracy. And so we require a decoding of not just the information, but the source from which the information comes, and as well, I would say, the container through which we access that information to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gennaro. And the discussion will be continued by Professor Maxim Lepskiy. Please.
Во-первых, я хочу поблагодарить за приглашение на столь уважаемую конференцию и такую интересную панель.
First of all, I would like to say thank you very much that you invited me to take part in this very interesting conference and to the first panel.
И хочу поделиться некоторыми размышлениями, которые связаны со статьей уважаемого профессора Прокопио и, собственно, о проблематике этой панели.
First of all, I would like to share with you some thoughts about article of Professor David Procoppio and some certain problems.
Насколько я понял из начала статьи, источники разграничивались прежде всего в научном и журналистском плане.
First of all, I would like to emphasize that, as I understood from the article of Professor Procoppio, all sources were delineated as scientific and as journalistic sources.
Но дело в том, что сейчас в изучении гиперреальности, постправды и других отклонений от поиска истины необходимо разграничивать, наверное, и с другими сферами.
But right now, when we talk about the study of hyperreality, the study of post-truth, we have to consider also different elements of sources.
Когда первоначально нам давали источниковедение, нам объясняли различия материальных духовных источников и других видов источников для исторических исследований.
First of all, when we start to do source studies, we have differentiated the material and spiritual sources.
И мы изучали эти источники как равноположенные. Профессор Прокопио дал иерархию этих источников.
We have studied the sources like all have the same level, but Professor Procoppio gave us hierarchy.
Но для социолога журналистские публикации не менее интересны, чем комплексное научное исследование, когда мы делаем контент-анализ и выбираем разнонаправленные журналистские источники.
But as a sociologist, I have to say that it's very interesting also to consider journalistic sources. So we make some kind of content analysis and we took journalistic sources as well.
Одновременно в экспедиционном корпусе мы прекрасно видели, что материальные источники, такие как архитектура, как символизм, обладают значительно более важным значением, в данном случае это тавтология, и важны наравне с другими видами источников, и дают очень хороший багаж знаний.
And as a member of expeditionary corpus, I have to say, but when we were in the expedition, we saw that material sources is also important. And when I say about material sources, I mean architecture, symbolism, and they has more important meaning as well, and we have to consider it also.
Исходя из этого, мне кажется, стоит обсудить проблему информации, факта и научного факта.
And it's worth to discuss the problem of information, of fact and scientific fact.
И сюда же теперь уже включается и субъективный факт, как нарратив, как рассказ от первого лица того или иного информатора.
And we also have to understand that this includes a subjective fact as well as some kind of narrative, some kind of spoken story from certain person.
Мы сталкиваемся с тем, что часто субъективные факты, нарративы, сторителлинги значительно важнее в эмоциональном и вдохновляющем значении, чем научные факты, чем истина.
And we have to also pay attention to the fact that often subjective facts are much more important in an emotional sense than scientific facts.
И это связано с новыми вызовами для науки, эпистемологии и гносеологии.
This is due to new challenges for the science of epistemology and gnoseology.
Поскольку сейчас неупорядоченный, дикий, социально-сетевой контент врывается в жизнь каждого, наука оказывается на обочине этого процесса.
And right now we face the situation when the network, social contents in everyone's life is everywhere. And the scientific facts, they come not in the center, but somewhere on the border.
Если первоначально источник научных знаний для детей была энциклопедия, то сейчас это интернет-источники, по которым детвора просто скользит.
And we also have to pay attention that before we had the situation when all children knew something new from the encyclopedia, but right now everybody goes to the internet to search some information for them.
И в результате мы получаем ребят, которые очень хорошо листают страницы в интернете, но абсолютно не хотят анализировать информацию.
And right now we see the new generation of young people that very good in searching in internet, in Google, of listing some kind of information, but at the same time they cannot analyze information at all.
Отсюда и возникает тот призыв к науке, который требует ответа и включения научного сообщества уже в качестве экспертного, от чего часто ученые отказываются.
And from this point, there is some kind of call for science, which requires scientific approach and requires scientific circles to involve to this situation to change something.
Одновременно ученый, который пытается довести истину в открытых публичных источниках, становится объектом хейтерства, атаки, ненависти и негативного языка.
And at the same time, if we take some certain scientist who wants to share the truth information with people, he faces the situation that everybody kind of hate him, and there are a lot of different so-called haters who not agree with his opinion, and they try to share their opinion that he is not right.
Поэтому, если возвращаться к классификации уважаемого профессора, то эта классификация основана на принципе доверия субъекту, что субъект исследования изначально стремится к истине.
And again, when we talk about the classification of Professor Procoppio, it is based on the principle of trust to the subject.
Но это, к сожалению, не всегда так. И не всегда ученые обладают инструментами для того, чтобы отсечь публичный моббинг по отношению к ученым.
But unfortunately, we have to say that it is not always so. Scientists very often do not have the tools to cut off these haters, this mobbing of different people.
И немаловажная проблема – это появление цензуры, потому что попытки этического приведения в порядок социальных сетей и информационных потоков вызывает традиционную проблему цензуры и свободы информации.
And also we have to understand that we have some problem of emergence of censorship. And this is a problem because when somebody tries to organize some social networks, all people start to claim that this is very bad for the voice of people who has who actually wants to be free to share any opinion they want.
Поэтому я хочу сказать спасибо за интересную проблематику, которую предложили организаторы. Я думаю, что обсуждение подобных классификаций акцентирует внимание все-таки на поиске истины.
And once again, I want to say thank you very much for this conference, for this first panel, because I think that discussion of such problems of classification, this brings something new that we can talk together, discuss together, and to find some answer and to find the truth.
Thank you very much, Professor Maxim Lepskiy. And here we come to the second question of today's panel. The challenges of choosing a credible source for conducting scientific research. Which sources are reliable and scientific? Which sources can be used in conducting the research? And I'm happy to give the floor to Dr. Oleg Maltsev.
Спасибо, что дали слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
Огромное спасибо всем профессорам, которые дали оценку самой классификации.
And Dr. Maltsev is very glad, and we are thankful to all you dear speakers for your evaluation of this source classification. Thank you so much.
Особенно спасибо профессору Максиму Лепскому.
And Dr. Maltsev is especially thankful to Professor Maxim Lepskiy
За конструктивную критику.
for constructive criticism block.
Да, потому что критика должна быть.
Because, well, as a matter of fact, speaking about something, critics is something that should be. It should be present.
А то нас еще, не дай бог, обвинять в необъективности.
Otherwise, you know, there are people who might try to blame of non-objectiveness, you know.
Да, и вот как раз Максиму Лепскому я как раз и хочу ответить во втором вопросе.
So the beginning of the speech of Dr. Maltsev would also contain a certain reply to criticism by Professor Lepskiy.
Дело в том, что, помните, я говорил, что это классификация универсальная.
Let me please remind you kindly that previously we were speaking about the fact that classification provided is something multifunctional.
То есть никто не делает никакую научную работу, если она никому не нужна.
It's kind of logical thing that no one carries or conducts a scientific research in case no one needs that very research, in case there is no necessity.
Да, и получается, что когда мы дискутировали уже после выполненной работы саму работу, мы эти вопросы все поднимали.
And Dr. Maltsev actually speaking in retrospect of the discussion with Professor Procoppio, because haven't finished the conduction of this research, they were already discussing all the things Professor Lepskiy mentioned in his criticism.
Да. И я как раз хочу рассказать, как профессор Прокопио ответил на эти вопросы, когда мы это дискутировали.
And Dr. Maltsev is eager to share with all of you the way Professor Procoppio was answering similar analogous questions.
То есть, когда стоял вопрос классификации, она не просто была нужна, эта классификация, то есть это иерархия классификации, то есть это степень достоверности снизу вверх.
So actually, to begin with, the classification didn't appear out of nothing, like, you know, out of air. It was the question of setting the hierarchy. And the thing that this classification is all about, this is the hierarchy of credibility. The credibility raises as this hierarchy ascends. So the less credible sources, they're right in the bottom. The most credible sources are right at the top of the hierarchy.
Да, очень многие люди не знают, я тоже по первому образованию историк, как и профессор Fylypovych, и так же, как и Maxim Lepskiy, как бы, да. И еще, когда я начинал свою историческую, как бы, карьеру, я ее не прекратил и по сей день, как бы, я всегда удивлялся, насколько история фактическая отличается от истории письменной.
And actually, Dr. Maltsev speaks right now that, well, not many people and not many scholars are aware of the fact that the very first scientific specialty of Dr. Maltsev is history. So primarily, he is historian, as well as Dr. Fylypovych, and as well as Professor Lepskiy. And the main idea Dr. Maltsev is expressing that he was always astonished by the way we see the difference, like a strong distinction between the real history and the things that are written about that very real history.
У нас в Советском Союзе был артист.
In the former USSR, there was one person, one great figure. He was an actor.
Его звали Задорнов, некая фамилия такая была, и он умер уже.
Well, actually, that very figure is Mikhail Zadornov. So Mr. Zadornov, actually, he has passed away. He's gone right now.
У него была такая некая юмористическая сцена.
And Zadornov, he was not only an actor, you know, he was holding several humoristic shows. And it was like one, Dr. Maltsev is going to speak about a short humoristic sketch of Zadornov.
Да, он говорит, существует такой врач ухо, горло, нос.
Zadornov would say there is such a doctor who cures ears, nose, and throat.
И вот он говорил, что мне нужен другой врач, только глаз и ухо.
And there is a person who comes and say, well, I need another doctor who would cure my eye and my ear.
Потому что по телевизору я вижу одно, а когда на улицу выхожу, слышу одно, а вижу другое на улице, да.
Why do I need someone to fix my eye and my ear simultaneously? Because every time I'm watching the TV, I see one thing, but when I go outside and start walking down the street, I see quite different thing.
И поэтому я вот точно так же, я когда работаю с письменными документами, я читаю одно, а потом еду куда-то и вижу совершенно другое. Как бы.
So this metaphor is all about the fact when we read something, we perceive certain information out of that written resource. But when we go somewhere, we see kind of different story that has nothing to do with this written document.
Да, и вот это очень важный аспект, потому что у нас считается почему-то в академической науке, что любой письменный документ превалирует над всеми иными доказательствами.
And this is top significant, extremely significant fact to mention, because right now, currently in academia, it is considered that a written document, like a written paper, is something prevailing in credibility over the other types of sources.
Но это совершенно не так.
But that's totally not true. It's incorrect.
Мало ли, что там написал кто-то 10 или 20 или 30 лет назад. Как бы.
Well, you know, no one's aware up to 100% who actually wrote something centuries ago, whether this is true or not. We cannot be sure.
Тогда они идут еще дальше.
But this is not the end.
Они говорят, вот научная работа.
Some people claim, you know, here I have my scientific publication.
Мы говорим, вы знаете, эта научная работа требует оценки и анализа, прежде чем принять ее данные как источник.
And we are reasoning in the following way. You know, this is just a publication. It's just a book. We cannot claim it's scientifically pure, reliable, because we have to discuss, we have to make the peer review, we have to actually think about, we have to check and verify it.
Они говорят, это докторская диссертация. Что вы такое говорите?
And the person who is the author of this publication, he is actually dissatisfied because he claims, you know what, this is my doctoral dissertation. If it is my doctoral dissertation, this is scientifically pure and credible source.
Мы говорим, какая разница, что это монография или докторская диссертация, дайте ее прочитать, мы хотим понять, что тут написано, потому что только потому, что здесь написано докторская диссертация, мы не можем все это принять на веру просто.
And the main idea is that in case some sort of publication claims doctoral dissertation, it doesn't mean that everything written there is true. Please give us that doctoral dissertation to read. We need to read first and evaluate second, but not just thoroughly believe that this is something true because it is entitled with doctoral dissertation.
То есть, по сути своей, любой научный источник требует серьезного анализа, прежде чем опираться на него в исследовании.
The main conclusion Dr. Maltsev is carrying out is that any source requires preliminary scientific analysis. And only afterwards, having analyzed this information, we can either rely on it because it is a credible one, or we cannot do that because it's not a credible one.
Вот у меня был очень интересный диалог с с профессором Джереми Красом, как бы из Соединенных Штатов Америки, из Нью-Йорка.
And Dr. Maltsev is ready to share some facts about very unique and interesting, peculiar discussion with a professor, Jaron Crace, who is currently living in the USA.
Мы 5 интервью записали.
They had 5 interviews together with Jaron Crace. I mean, Dr. Maltsev and Jaron Crace.
В том числе о проблемах современной науки, в том числе американской науки сегодня.
And in one of these 5 interviews, they were also discussing the current problematics of this source credibility.
И так вот, мы пришли к выводу, что сегодня визуальные методы и методы научного расследования выходят на первый план вот этой третьей категории как бы научной методологии и в Европе, и в Соединенных Штатах Америки.
And both Dr. Jeremy Crace and Dr. Maltsev have come to the mutual conclusion that visual methods of scientific investigation are top prevailing methods, helping one to distinguish the credible and reliable sources from non-credible and non-reliable ones.
Потому что на самом деле то, что мы как бы с вами сегодня имеем вот такую классификацию, тут, которую сделал наш коллега, это первый шаг к тому, чтобы прекратить эти, я бы так сказал, инсинуации на тему, что научно, что не научно.
And this very classification that Dr. Procoppio carried out is actually like the very first step. It's like the step number 1, helping to stop and to cut away all discussions about fakes, credible, non-credible, etc. It's something that helps to distinguish and carry out conclusions.
Вот я провел эксперимент, я спросил у 10 профессоров, что такое научная работа, то есть вот монография, как вы оцениваете, это научная работа или не научная?
Dr. Maltsev also has conducted a kind of an experiment. He has asked 10 different experts about the way they evaluate a certain scientific paper and conduct a conclusion that this is a real scientific paper.
И поверьте мне, это было очень затруднительно.
And you know, all these 10 experts felt it was a tricky and complicated question.
Я думаю, что мы еще поговорим в процессе конференции, на эту тему, как одно отличается как бы от другого. А сейчас я хотел бы сказать очень важные вещи. Дело в том, что когда вы исследуете, например, такие вещи, как субкультуры, религии, например, или криминальные как бы сообщества, вам очень тяжело работать, потому что письменные источники одни противоречат как бы другим.
But we shall discuss these issues later on within our online panels and in the other days. However, right now, Dr. Maltsev is emphatic about the fact there are certain areas like subculture, religion field, or the field of criminality that brings lots of barriers in your research. Likewise, you're facing many different sources that are carrying out information or opinions or perspectives that totally contradict one another.
То есть вам приходится 2 работы делать.
And these pushes you actually to conduct 2 types of research.
Сначала расследование проводить на базе исследовательской концепции, для того, чтобы понять, как на самом деле все.
Because first of all, you should carry out research concept helping you to investigate scientifically all these things and distinguish what can you use and what you cannot.
А потом на базе этого научного расследования проводить собственное научное исследование.
And this is like step number one, scientific. It was like a step number one. And step number two, when you are carrying out your scientific research, you primarily wanted to.
В нашей академической науке почему-то считается, что существует верховенство ранее проведенных исследований.
In our current academia, there is such There is such a stereotype that actually all previously researched fields, they are like top hierarchy things we should refer to and believe.
То есть, если вы, не дай бог, провели какое-то исследование, а до этого какой-то профессор проводил исследование, и, не дай бог, ваши исследования не совпадают, то вы, конечно, негодяй. Ну, как бы это 100%.
The main idea is as follows. Right in case you have conducted a research and you have received certain results. In case your results contradict to the results of some previous people or even guys, well, it means that you are just a malicious scholar. You are not a good one. How could you dare to contradict to some other people?
Профессор Прокопио на доске написал, он написал, что авторитет научный не является источником научной информации. Поставил огромный восклицательный знак.
When they were discussing these things together with Professor Procoppio would take a marker, go to the whiteboard, and then he wrote on that whiteboard that if there is a person who is authority in science, like authority, responsible person, his authority is not equal to the reliability of information he provides.
То есть, по сути, сегодня все эти проблемы, которые я описываю, они в какой-то степени разрешаются этой классификацией.
To summarize all the things listed, we should say that certain problems we are facing in science, they are, actually this classification helps us to resolve all these things.
Да. А с моей личной точки зрения, если хотите знать мое мнение, то доказательства эксперимента, работа на стыке наук и есть критерий истинности.
And from a personal perspective of Dr. Maltsev, verification, interdisciplinary research, experimental and approbation steps of research, these are the things that altogether help to be objective and bring the reliable and credible research results.
Спасибо, дорогие коллеги.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues.
Thank you very much, Professor Maltsev. And the discussion will be continued by Dr. Kellner. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, so I'm very happy that the panel took such a broad view of science and evidence in so many different fields. It was very stimulating, and I think it'll make an excellent publication. We've covered natural sciences, especially with Professor Procoppio. We've covered social and cultural sciences. We're going to hear more about religion and religious evidence. We heard about material culture, digital and broadcast media as sources of information and evidence. And that's what I will be addressing in my comments. I want to talk about how to distinguish reliable information from false information and fake news in the field of media culture and digital culture, and argue that we need critical and digital media literacies. By the way, I also like that all the different panelists took a critical and are taking critical approaches. So we're having a very provocative and stimulating critical discussion of these issues. So as for media culture, let's talk about how to evaluate sources of news and information to distinguish fact from falsehood, science from superstition, lies, and ideology. So take as an example that I did earlier, COVID-19. What counts as reliable evidence? And here the answer is simple, science. That the experts on COVID-19 are our professional scientists like Dr. Anthony Fauci, our science and medical organizations and experts on viral diseases and pandemics, who are the ones that can provide reliable evidence, whereas people like Trump and certain politicians and the media often provide unreliable evidence. Now, the reason we can trust our science and our scientific experts in providing reliable evidence in COVID-19 is because they have a history of doing it in the past. There was a terrible global plague of Spanish flu in the 1920s, and scientists throughout the world found vaccines. They were able to cure the plague. When I was growing up in the United States in the 1950s, we had a polio epidemic. It was a very dangerous disease, and the doctors came up with polio vaccines. I was lucky, I lived in California, and one of the medical teams that developed the vaccine I had access to. So I was protected against polio, flu. For many decades, I traveled around the world and I got every flu you can imagine, Asian flu, African flu, flus from Europe. And then suddenly, I guess in the 1990s, a flu vaccine was developed. So every year I get a flu vaccine and I haven't, had serious flu disease since. So science can be counted on as reliable, medical science, by its results, by its verification, its tests, and the data that has accumulated. So this is an easy answer. The science is tested, confirmed, successful, provides reliable evidence, and Procoppio's paper encompasses a broad field to assess the reliability of sources in science. But what about the media and the internet? How do we determine reliable from false information, say about COVID or any other thing from news? Here I suggest we need a cultural studies approach. That first we need to evaluate the sources of media information, and that we need critical and media literacies to distinguish between not reliable and reliable information, truth and falsities. We need to have critical media literacy to be able to read and understand the media, as Marshall McLuhan and Jean Baudrillard have told us. Now, when I was growing up in America in the 1950s, this was easy. We had 3 commercial broadcasting television networks and 1 public broadcasting. And most countries in the 1950s, when television first emerged, had 1 state broadcasting network, like the BBC in the UK, or French, German, or Russian state broadcasting, that dominated the news and generally presented the dominant ideologies of their country. So television news in its early day was not especially reliable, since it was controlled by big broadcasting corporations that had their biases, or state media organizations, which often presented government propaganda or the dominant ideology of the country. I might note that when I was growing up in this situation, my family and I decided that CBS News, one of our 3 best broadcasting systems. The Columbia Broadcasting was the best source of news and information because during World War II, in the fight against fascism, they provided the most reliable information. That people like Edward R. Murrow, Walter Cronkite from CBS News were the most respected, the most trusted broadcasters. So they were the reliable voices that I listened to when I was growing up because they were reliable because of their history, because of their record, because of verifiability, that these guys were the best. Other sources of information, of course, from the media are newspapers. Interestingly, my first job was I was a paper boy with the Washington Post. So I delivered the Washington Post in Falls Church, Virginia. In my neighborhood, everyone subscribed to the Washington Post because, like my father, they worked for the US government, or they worked for the Pentagon or the CIA or other, government agencies. So they had to read the Washington Post, that everyone agreed was the most reliable source of information on US government. During the Watergate crisis in the 1970s, it was the Washington Post that did the criticism of Richard Nixon and his administration and led to the Watergate scandal and Nixon resigning. Then I moved up to Long Island in New York City, and my second job was delivering the New York Times. The New York Times is generally rated our #1 newspaper. And so every day I should note, after I delivered my papers, the Washington Post or the New York Times, I read these papers. So they were reliable. They gave me good information. I could trust them. And then once I started studying media sources, I saw the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian in the UK were, the most reliable English language newspapers. Now it's much harder today with the internet because there's many more sources. However, the sources that I rely on for news and information are still the New York Times that has a website, the Washington Post that has a website and internet, the Guardian, and other blogs and sources of information that I trust. But there's literally thousands. So critical media and digital literacy today is very difficult. For instance, we now have a cable news channel where we have 3 cable news channels. And if you watch 2 of them, you live in different worlds. Fox News is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's a conservative that was completely pro-Trump, pro-Republican Party. So it repeated all of his lies, propaganda, etc. But another one of our cable networks, MSNBC, was completely anti-Trump, was more democratic, liberal, pro-Obama, pro-Biden, etc. So I found they had better news, but they have a bias. They have a point of view or perspective. So critical media literacy requires that you understand the bias of your news sources, as well as the reliability. What is their politics? What are their perspectives? So even the New York Times during the Vietnam War published articles that were lies. Actually, even the Iraq War, there was a New York Times reporter that was continually writing that Iraq and Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, whereas they didn't. So sometimes even your most reliable sources of information give you misinformation. So you basically have to have a skeptical and critical perspective towards media and internet information, but you also have to decide what are the reliable sources, which are the ones that have proved, that have tested, that have proved themselves to be reliable. So that will conclude my presentation. And I will step out for a minute to get some more coffee, and then I will come back in a minute. So thank you.
Thanks, dear Professor. And we give the floor to Professor Fylypovych.
With great pleasure, I would like to continue our discussion, and I could share the ideas of Professor Lepskiy and Professor Maltsev concerning the authority of different sources. And we decided with Professor Sagan to expert the church sources, and we make a question before us, whether the authority of church can guarantee the veracity of some sources, some documents, and is it possible to trust church sources? Is this church the authoritative source for us, for modern scholars, free from, for example, from inner censorship or manipulation or tentaciousness? No. And we, as example, take the document, the collection of documents which prepared by Russian Orthodox Church, and to expert this collection of documents, historical documents. I mentioned that 2 years ago, the Orthodox Encyclopedia Church Science Center, very important, the most authoritative church science platform, publish the collection of documents, reunification of Kiev Metropolitanate with Russian Orthodox Church. And we decided to investigate, is it authority materials, and could we use this collection of documents in our investigation? The reason for appearance of this collection is clearly stated by the head of Department of External Church Relations of Moscow Patriarchate, Metropolite Ilarion Talfeyev, in the preface to the book. In particular, according to the Metropolitan, until 2018, the Patriarchate of Constantinople unconditionally recognized the full jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate over the Kievan Metropolitanate. And only in 218, Constantinople made an attempt to revoke the Act of 1686 and extend its jurisdiction to Ukraine. This collection is, in fact, a response of the Moscow Patriarchate to the decision of the Holy Synod of Constantinople Church, dated in 2018, according to which the obligation of synodal letter of 1686 issued in the circumstance of that time was cancelled. It gave the Patriarch of Moscow the right to ordain the Metropolitan of Kiev, elected by the Council of Clergy and faithful of his diocese, who was to mention the ecumenical patriarchate in his first heresy in any service, proclaiming and confirming his canonical depends on a mother church. The format of the response significantly affected the quality and accompanying materials and submission of the documents themselves. We are talking about the substitution of concept, the lack of original text, a manipulative presentation of text in modern translation, and arbitrary reduction of sources. Substitution of concept begins with the very title of collection. After all, at the time of accession of the Kiev Metropolitanate to Moscow Patriarchate, the Ruskaya Pravoslavnaya Cerkev, Russian Orthodox Church, simply did not exist in nature. It received this name only in 1943. From the beginning of the 18th century and until 1943, this church was called the Российская Православная Church, Russian Orthodox Church. In the 17th century, the period analyzed in this collection, this church was called the Moscow Orthodox Church. The Moscow Patriarchate was the parallel and equivalent name to it. In addition, the term reunion, exception of the rejected, is used here in the context of exception of the rejected Kiev Metropolitanate to the Moscow Patriarchate. But if we follow the historical course of events objectively, it is the Moscow Metropolitanate, later the Patriarchate, that separated from Kiev Metropolitanate. This self-separation is evidenced by the fact that metropolitans who ruled the already dependent since 1448 Moscow Metropolitan bore the title of Kiev and all of Rus, and only since 1471 they are called Moscow. Given the above, we can conclude the compiles in the title of collection deliberately destroyed the essence of events that took place in the last quarter of 17th century in the Kiev Metropolitanate. In the book, 246 sources have been collected, which, according to the authors, most fully reflect the events of 1676-1686. The sources are translated into modern Russian, often without providing the text of the original documents. In many cases, such originals have not survived, which calls into question to the authenticity of their content. In 33 cases out of 276, it's about 13%, documents were submitted in fragments. The principle according to which these fragments were selected is not stipulated. This gives room for tendentious reflections of the essence of the document, citation of those parts of it that confirm the concept of the compilers, avoid citation, in fact, identity, this concept. In fact, it's about the idea formed in the days of Tsar Peter I of Moscow, about the desire of the clergy of the Kiev Metropolitanate to move to the jurisdiction of the Moscow Church and the approval of such as act to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Moreover, according to the Moscow historians, such as agreement was complete and without any conditions final. The presentation of this concept and its jurisdiction, justification, by the way, occupy almost quarter of the volume of the collection, and it set out both the beginning of the book and the final comments. You can ask, is it so important what and how the documents are presented in the collection? Yes, it is important for us, for Ukraine, for Ukrainian science, for Ukrainian church, because tendentious sources not only distort history, but also influence on modernity, falsely justify the experience of the 300 years dependence of the Kiev Metropolitanate of the Moscow Patriarchate, deny the Ukrainian Church the right to return to their mother church, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, allow the existence of anti-Ukrainian communities in Ukraine which openly work for Moscow Patriarchate, the aggressor Russia. The collection, for example, cites documents about the persecutions of Orthodox Christians in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the struggle of the Moscow sites for their rights. But you cannot find any document about the resistance of Ukrainians to the Moscow church authorities. Here in this collection, there is a correspondence between Rus, Ukrainian clergy, and laity with Moscow leaders, Tsar officials, diplomats, who were actually sold the Moscow to money and no documents on how they destroy the church elite of Ukraine, which defends its church from Moscow spiritual and physical expansion. And many other questions we could arise in this situation. A separate page novella, this is the documents which contain the diplomas of the Patriarchate of Constantinople from 1686, as well as decision of the Synod of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. But I have no time to describe this novella. I think that we could describe this novella in the article which we prepare with Professor Sagan for printing, and I hope that my colleague from the Maltsev Center could help us to translate this article very near to our idea. So I could conclusions exploring the history of Kiev Metropolitanate of one of its most difficult period. The compiles of analyzed collection embarked on the path of substituting concept, manipulations, and tendentious selection of sources. Even according to the letters of the Patriarchate of Constantinople published in the collection, the Ecumenical Patriarchate provide clear criteria for its cooperation with the Moscow Patriarchate in the matter of the filling of the Kiev Metropolitanate. Therefore, agreeing with the chapter of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Moscow Patriarchate undertook the following obligation: not to interfere in the choice of metropolitan and only to ordain him, not to interfere to the affairs of the Ukrainian metropolitan. In every liturgy on the territory of Kiev Metropolitanate to commemorate the Ecumenical Patriarchate as the head of the church. And it is not difficult to check where the Moscow Patriarchate is fulfilling its obligation even now. If you do not read the history of Kiev Metropolitanate after 1686, come to the liturgy in any church of Moscow Patriarchate operating in Kiev Metropolitanate, and there is enough to listen who the priests remember as the head of the church, for whom they pray. And answer is obvious for Moscow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fylypovych, and we give the floor to Dr. Gennaro.
Thank you. And thanks again to all the speakers. Wonderful, extremely insightful, and so much interesting information being brought forward. Thank you. The question asks us what kind of sources are reliable and which kind of sources can we use. Professor Maxim said earlier today, he noted how young people, how they are using Google or the internet as their space for finding their knowledge. And to that, I would say, you know, in 2018, the Pew Research Center in the United States published a report on social media and technology for young people, where Zhang and Anderson noted that 95% of American teens have access to a smartphone, and 45% of them said that they are online almost constantly. I think this is interesting because if we go back to 2012, an earlier Pew Research report, 1/3 of all Americans reported at that point that they accessed their daily news information from their smartphones or tablets. 1/3. And at that point, only 45% claimed to have owned smartphones. So we've seen a drastic increase in the number of smartphones that are being owned or used by the American public. We've seen that now trickle down. So now it's also our young people, youth and teens, who have an enormous access to these devices. And we see, again, a spike or an increase in how they are using them as their first point of contact for information that they are then deeming to be credible and knowledge. So are they doing the work? Are we doing the work to ask questions about the information we engage with when we engage with it so rapidly through our devices. Again, as you know, what about the authority of these sources? You know, if we look at in this particular instance, you know, just a couple months ago, this same Pew Research Center did a study about how Americans get their news, and they noted that a quarter of adult Americans suggested that they got their news primarily from YouTube. 1/4, 26%. And actually 72%, so almost 3/4 responded from their research that they deemed YouTube to be an important way to get news. So a quarter found it the primary source, but almost 3/4 said it was an important way for them to get news. And if we take this even further, so again, what kind of sources are reliable? Which sources can be used? How about asking the question, what sources are being used? As our starting point. What if we had a hierarchy to build on what Professor Maltsev was saying just a little bit earlier? You know, we had a hierarchy here of sources that didn't show us which ones were already credible, but how about how they are interpreted as being credible by the reader? So if the reader is telling us that YouTube is their primary source, 26% of them, and 72% are saying that it is an important way to get it. That's a significant issue, especially because when we break down the numbers of how they were accessing these YouTube channels for news, for information, which they are again not digesting, they are accepting it as healthy food. If we break that down, we get an interesting breakdown here. 49%, okay, were associated with news organizations. So that meant of the most popular news channels on YouTube in 2019, from where they did their research, 49% were associated with news organizations. That's only half, just less than half. And in order to be included in the study as a channel to be explored by the Pew Research Center, you had to have at least 100,000 subscribers. Okay, so this is a very big channels that we're drawing on, that people are accessing for their information. But get this, 42% of these channels were independent, which means there is no fact checking, which means there is no reliability or credibility to that source. And yet we know that a quarter of Americans get it as their primary source of news or information. We know that almost 3/4 say it's an important way to get news, but the channels that they are accessing, again, channels with over 100,000 subscribers in 2019, 42% of those were independent. So what do we know about the content that they are putting forward? We know that 70%, so the shape, 70% of the content center around one person, a personality, an individual personality, a YouTuber or a public figure. And again, going back to the point Professor Oleg made before, how do we separate the authority of the information from the authority of the individual who's delivering the information, right? I believe that he mentioned that point. How interesting that 70% of these independent center around one particular figure. We also found from these independent news sources, again, 42% of the news sources were independent, these channels, that they were twice as likely to produce a negative tone of information. So the information they were delivering had a negative tone to it. 37% of those to 17 that came from the news organizations. So they are delivering a very skewed version of the information to their public. And this follows into the next point, which is that of these independents, 14% of all the videos that they studied from the Pew Research Center connected to or mentioned or discussed conspiracy theories, unsubstantiated conspiracy theories, whether it be towards COVID or towards vaccines or towards war or towards government conspiracies or cover-ups and a whole series of other things associated. And it was less than 2% in terms of legitimate news organizations when it came to discussing these same categories. So I would ask the question here then about what kind of sources are reliable, or what kind of sources are being accessed in our everyday lives and being told to us our news or our information or our knowledge. And again, this goes back to the importance of, I think, of the Procoppio article and of having some type of hierarchy of seeing that we need to be fact-checking the facts, that we need to be asking questions about the sources and about the information itself. Lastly, what I will say on this is that, back to my first point, way back when I started this in the first question, is that it's very important to think about the container that this information comes from. Because when we're accessing news through YouTube or looking up information on Google and through the internet, it's often through the phone. It's often through the phone. Again, 95% of American youth have a phone. 45% admit to being online almost all day long. So there's a primacy, an intimacy, and an expediency of the apparatus like never before. They are handheld and they are mobile. They're kept close to our body, often like on our body from the moment we wake up. They follow us everywhere we go. We use them multiple times in multiple roles. We check them for news and for weather and for updates to our friends and to our family. And because of that, we develop a relationship of trust. Again, a point that was raised earlier by the other panelists. We make a connection of trust to the information that we get from the apparatus. And when we do that, when we put a primacy on of trust to the apparatus, we then extend that trust to the information that we get from it. And this is why, again, having some level of what are reliable sources and what are not is very important. Having a hierarchy of these is very important, and having a criteria, what Professor Douglas Kellner calls critical media literacy, a criteria to assess the validity, the authenticity, the legitimacy of these sources is also so important. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gennaro. And we give the floor to Professor Maxim Lepskiy.
Спасибо за предоставленное слово. Вот, и еще раз хочу поблагодарить моего коллегу Олега Викторовича за критику моей критики, вот, что вызывает обязательно интересную дискуссию. И хотелось бы тоже пояснить некоторые моменты.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor once again, and I want to thank you very much to Dr. Maltsev that you made criticize for my critique of this first question, and right now I want to share certain thoughts.
Я увидел в классификации уважаемого профессора действительно иерархически выстроенные источники, особенно первые 4 я беру сверху.
First of all, I want to say that talking about the classification of Professor Procoppio, I saw a certain hierarchy, and especially I want to speak about first 4 elements of this hierarchy.
Поскольку теоретическое в этой позиции самое нижнее, тут вполне усматривается принцип Гегеля от абстрактного к конкретному.
I want to say that when we speak about theoretical part, this is not the previous one. And also I want to pay attention that when we look of this hierarchy, we see the principle of Hegel from abstract, от абстрактного к конкретному, верно? From abstract to the concrete.
Позже, поднимаясь по этой иерархии, мы видим, рассматривается практическая часть, то есть связанная с экспериментами, опытами и так далее, что тоже известно в методологии как принцип корреспондентной теории истины.
And going up by this hierarchy, we also see the practical side of this hierarchy. And it talks about experimental part and also a certain principle. Можете, пожалуйста, повторить принципы?
Корреспондентной теории Аристотеля.
We see the principles of correspondent theory of Aristotle.
Позже, поднимаясь к следующему этапу практическому, здесь виден критерий, собственно, практика как критерий истинности теории.
And going upper on this hierarchy, we see also this the next stage, which is practical, and this is practical criteria as a criteria of the truth.
И поднимаясь к самому верхнему составному источнику, мы смотрим когерентную теорию или теорию связанности истины во время изучения научных данных, фактов и так далее.
And when we go to the top of the hierarchy, we see the top coherent theory, which is connectivity theory, when we study some certain facts in science.
И в этой основе, я думаю, что классификация достаточно продумана и верифицирована, поскольку верификация как раз и предполагает связности всех основных критериев истинности.
And talking about this, I think that this hierarchy is very verified, because when we speak about verification, it suggests this connectivity.
Критика касалась как раз вопроса, который поднимал и уважаемый профессор Дуглас и другие, в общем-то, наши коллеги, связано с тем, что молодежь сейчас не хочет изучать логические процедуры верификации.
And what about the criticism that was also concerned by Professor Douglas and our colleagues? We talk about that we have a situation when young people, they do not search for the truth in these internet sources.
Один из коллег, который основал в Одессе философское общество, я сейчас говорю об Авенире Уемове, написал когда-то книгу о логических ошибках в выведении понятий, умозаключений и суждений. К сожалению, этих ошибок в интернет-источниках и в других источниках масс-медиа слишком много.
And right now I want to share with you about some certain principles made by Venir Uyomov, who was the founder of Philosophical Society in Odessa. He was spoken about logical mistakes in the reasoning of certain people. And when we talk about internet, we see that there are a lot of logical mistakes and errors.
Плюс добавляется просто привычная лень людей, которые не хотят напрягать себя во время исследований.
And also we have to speak about the laziness of people who actually do not want to research something. They just want to get information very fast, and that's it.
И в результате борьба ведется за внимание, за яркость эмоциональное изложение факта. И мы знаем, что новость вообще живет не больше 2 суток.
And right now we face the situation when all we see, it is the fight for attention, for emotional presentation of certain facts. And we also know that any news, they live like 2 days.
И вот мой коллега сказал о том, что приоритет предыдущих ранних исследований, к сожалению, сейчас у нас часто требуют, чтобы источники были только за последние 5 лет изданные. Это еще один критерий, который отвергает научность, а вводит позицию моды или свежести публикаций.
And also, when we talk about priority of previous research, right now we face the situation when all scientific that research something, they can refer to some works for the past 5 years of history. So sources has to be not more than 5 years ago. And also we can understand that it rejects scientificity, and it makes some kind of fashion in the science.
Поэтому вопросы закономерности, как повторяющести, объективности, необходимости и так далее в исследовании и достоверности источников становятся не просто важной, а чрезвычайно важной проблемой для философов и ученых.
And and right now we face the situation when objectivity, reliability, and accuracy of source studies, it is very important problems that we have right now.
И я согласен с нашим коллегой Стивом, профессором Стивом, о том, что молодежь действительно сейчас больше находится в масс-медийном пространстве, чем в реальной практике и науке.
And I also have to say that I agree with Professor Steve that right now we have young people who every time they involved in some mass media sphere, in some social media, and they do not have practical experience at all.
Сегодня была встреча экспертов при посольстве Евросоюза, и представитель Министерства образования приводила данные, что 60% молодежи не хотят ни знать, ни заниматься какой-то активной деятельностью.
And today there was a meeting in the embassy of European Union, and the education minister said that 60% of young people, they do not want to be involved in some activity at all.
Это именно в Украине.
And I speak right now about Ukraine.
Поэтому у научных исследований стоит вопрос не только верификации исследований, а еще и создания следующего поколения исследователей, которые будут этим пользоваться.
And right now we have not only the question of verification of scientific data, but also the creation of the next generation who actually will be involved in a research study.
Вот поэтому это те тезисы, с которыми я хотел познакомить коллег.
These all my theses that I wanted to share with my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maxim Lepskiy. And our panel is about to be over. However, we have a question from Professor Fylypovych. Professor Fylypovych, are you ready to formulate your question, or would you like me to read it?
You, Kanykei, you translate, please, in English.
Yes, I'll be reading it in English. So Professor Fylypovych's question for Dr. Maltsev is the following. Let's suppose that a church is not a guarantee for the reliability of the source. An authority in scientific field is not a guarantee, and official data is not. Then what could be considered to be a reliable source? When we speak about religious people, about believers, then certainly in their case, God would be that guarantee. But when we speak about secular part of the society, people that do not accept that response and they want more elaborate response, what should we tell them? И вопрос профессора Людмилы Fylypovych следующий. Что если церковь или научный авторитет кого-то или официальные данные не гарантируют достоверность источника, то что гарантирует эту достоверность? Для верующих, безусловно, гарантом может быть Бог, а как быть ученому или светскому человеку, для которого этот ответ недостаточен?
Мне очень лестно, что такой грант, как профессор Fylypovych, задает мне такой вопрос.
Professor Maltsev, in his original way, exclaims that he is flattered and astonished that such a grandiose researcher and scholar as Professor Liudmyla Fylypovych is asking him of such a question.
Я попробую ответить, в общем-то, объективно так.
And Dr. Maltsev is going to take an attempt to answer in an objective way.
Помните наш диалог между мной и Джереми Крассом?
We have to remind about certain dialogue or an interview with Jeremy Crace.
То есть, по сути своей, вот этот способ научного расследования независимыми экспертами, как бы, он дает единственные и наиболее точные результаты.
we are speaking about the fact that the methods of scientific investigation conducted by independent experts and researchers brings and carries out the most, let me say, objective conclusions and results.
То есть вот я бы хотел бы обратить внимание, это когда касается вот достоверности тех источников, с которыми мы работаем.
And right now, of course, we are discussing the context of authority of sources we are relying upon.
Я, конечно, понимаю, что сегодня найти незаинтересованных людей, объективных, достаточно сложно.
And as a matter of fact, we realize that the task of finding an expert who is independent, who is objective, who is like a non-interested figure, this is very complicated task today.
В таком случае, может быть, необходимо проводить 2 параллельных расследования, а потом сопоставлять данные.
This is the ground that pushes us to the conclusion it is a good idea to conduct 2 researches.
Может быть, необходимо после этих 2 независимых расследований открывать конференцию и открывать научную дискуссию относительно результатов обоих расследований.
By 2 researches, we mean 2 independent researches, like line 1 and line 2. And then afterwards, it is a great idea to organize a conference that helps to discuss the results of both lines of investigation.
И напоследок я вас разрешите повеселю всех.
And to finalize and to summarize the monologue, Dr. Maltsev would like to share a piece of joy with you.
У меня очень много друзей в Европе ученых.
He has lots of friends and French scholars in Europe.
Да, и они это с Heidelbergского университета, с итальянских университетов, с австрийских университетов.
By these friends and scholars and scientists, we mean professors at Heidelberg University, of Palermitano and the other Italian universities, of Austrian universities, etc.
И вот как-то в Австрии мы собрались, нас было 10 человек.
And once upon a time, they gathered together in Austria, and there were 10 people.
И был один профессор с Heidelbergского университета, он был очень жесткий, такой непримиримый к современной науке.
And among these 10 people, there was one professor from Heidelberg, that's in Germany, and he was very strict, very severe, very tough in his judgments professor.
И он даже как немец, знаете, каждый очень дотошный.
And you know, being a professor of a German origin, he is a German, naturally,
Да.
he is very accurate in his reasoning and judgments.
И вот он говорит, что вы понимаете, когда вот касается этих религиозных парней, как вот этих всяких монахов, переписывающих и так далее и тому подобное, там все время одни и те же истории происходят.
And that German professor, he was speaking about the fact every time we are dealing somehow with all these religious studies and religious things, we usually face the same original stories, like the same plots. Likewise, certain monks are sitting somewhere in the temple and rewriting a certain treatise.
То кусок стены отвалился, библиотеку нашли.
Or there is one more plot that actually is known worldwide, you know, like somewhere after maybe some certain of like the earth shook and then half of building collapsed and it revealed an ancient library that was hidden.
И пока ее переписывали, эту библиотеку,
And then professors who are finding these libraries, they say, wow, and they start rewriting the books of this
она
library.
при выясненных обстоятельствах сгорела.
And they rewrite these books of this library, but then afterwards, somehow this library is burned
И вот остались только переписанные копии.
or drowned. And you know, there are no original documents because the story says everything just drowned or was burned, and we only face the rewritten copies of it.
И он говорит, это же, обратите внимание, насколько грязная работа.
And that Heidelberg professor summarizes this very story with a certain exclamation. You know, this is a very dirty work.
Да, он говорит, вот в свое время я исследовал Испанскую империю.
And moreover, that very professor was also researching the history of Spanish Empire.
Они там их и святых наплодили, что аж Папа Римский их дергал назад, хватит, достаточно.
And you know, all these people who were creating the history, yeah, they really created lots of saint people, gods, and they were too imaginative in their choices that even the Papa of Rome tried to stop them and say, well, enough, no more saints, please.
Да, но еще при этом, при всем, он говорит, все переделали, все переписали, все сделали. Ну, говорит, посмотрите, когда сколько чистая работа, не подкопаешься.
And even though these monks of Spanish Empire times, many centuries ago, they really imagined and wrote and revealed certain documents about saint people, still they managed to do that on such a high professional level that right now we cannot say something otherwise. No?
Да, и вот в Одессе говорят, если себя держите за дурака, держите правильно. То есть, как бы, ну, если уже вы там подделываете, то подделывайте так, ну, чтобы, когда ты смотришь и видишь подделку, ты прям видел и говорил, ну, люди потрудились, действительно, специалисты работали, как бы, да.
You know, in Odessa, here on the southern coast of Ukraine, there is a saying. I'll try to interpret just as sharp as possible. In Odessa, they say, if you consider the person you're speaking to an idiot, please hold me as an idiot correctly. Do it in a classic way. Do it in the way I'm gonna love it and like it. Make a great performance. Play it with your soul, so that I know that this is fake, the thing you're doing, but I'm trying to believe because you're such a professional player.
Да, и, в общем-то, таких, ну, историй по всему миру, ну, их миллионы просто. И люди, которые, как бы, занимаются вот всем этим, ну, вы же понимаете, что это же политика, да, то есть, как бы, это, в общем-то, политические вещи, то есть все меняется, искажается в силу того, что это кому-то нужно.
And of course, all these stories, all these plots, they're many people are well aware of them. And of course, all this fake news or fake documents production approaches, they are the same and they're getting repeated from century to century. And of course, this also is tightly connected with the aspect of politics. This is usually this is just a political matter, why these things happen.
Да, и мое пожелание, оно только одно: нанимайте профессионалов.
And the recommendation of Dr. Maltsev is as follows: hire experts, hire professionals.
Не жадничайте денег.
Don't be mean. Don't try to save your money.
Ну, стыдно, когда патриарх всей Руси не может 2 строчки прочитать, как бы.
Because, you know, it's really shameful. It's a matter of a shame when the patriarch of, let me say, Russian Orthodoxy, he is incapable of reading 2 sentences. It's shameful.
Смотрит документы, читает другое. Ну, это же безобразие.
We mean when he watches the documents and reads something that's never was written in this document.
Да.
It's shameful.
Поэтому, если что-то подделываете, делайте это профессионально.
So
Спасибо,
even in
Роман.
case you are making a fake, make it in a professional way. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maltsev. Thank you all dear speakers. I would like to express sincere gratitude on the behalf of entire organizing and scientific committee of the conference. And we are about to finish this online panel. In the course of several weeks, the organizing committee will be preparing the resolution of the conference and the collected papers books. And every speaker is going to be notified accordingly on the media coverage as well and the materials as well. So it was an honor, a pleasure. Thank you all participants for your participation and discussion.
Thank you.
Спасибо большое. До встречи.
Bye-bye.
До встречи.